Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Thanks, Jack.
Am I in the correct position now, John?
You are in the correct position.
Great.
Today we're very lucky to be joined by someone who is actually about to join us at Melbourne Athletic Development, and we thought we would spend some time going through a bit of his background because we think that he's got some unique skills that some of our listeners would be very interested to hear about. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do and maybe what you're going to be doing here at Melbourne Athletic Development?
Cool. Thanks, John. So I'm a newly graduated physiotherapist. I finished my master's degree from Melbourne Uni at the end of last year. I will be joining the team as a physiotherapist, and I guess what I hope to bring that's maybe a little bit different to others is a background, particularly in distance running, and some experience, particularly with distance running footwear as well. So
tell us a little bit about both of those. Obviously, you've alluded you're a distance runner. Tell us a little bit about what kind of distance running you do. And then the other thing that you do is obviously you've worked for a number of years for a company that, we've done a bit with and is doing a lot, I think, in the running community in Melbourne, which is the running company. You're based out at the Clifton Hill setup, and I know they've just recently done that up, which looks really cool. Give us a little bit of background about your running history and what you're focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, cool. So I guess right now I'm more of a kind of 5K upwards sort of runner. So I race a little bit on the track over the 5,000 meter distance. And then I'll also race on the roads up to doing my first marathon at the end of this year.
Nice.
Not the end of this year, middle of this year, I should say.
Excited for that?
Yeah, it's I'm keen to get kind of a good block of training in and challenge myself over a slightly different distance to what I've done previously.
Obviously this is your first marathon, and it seems to be the case if we look at it that people, they spend their time building their sort of 5 and 10K speed or so-called speed, and then they end up going up towards the marathon. Can you explain a little bit about that? And is that changing, or is that something that's been pretty common? Because I have noticed that actually, the guy that just went out and ran really quick, what's his young guy that's just come out and run really fast in the marathon? He's still very young.
Australian?
No, not Australian.
The American.
We don't have any fast marathon runners. No, I think he's Kenyan.
Calvin Kipsum. Yeah. I think the culture in Australia is that I think a lot of people will enter particularly competitive running from, during their teenage years through school.
Yep.
And typically at that point, one, you're not old enough to compete in any longer distances. So you kind of...
Do they actually limit you, do they?
Yeah, most of them tend to be, you have to be over 18 to be able to compete in a marathon.
Yeah. Well, that seems reasonable, yeah.
So a lot of people tend to focus on shorter distances, and the ones that are available to them are usually 8 and 1,500,
yep.
Maybe some 5Ks, and then cross country.
Yep.
So I think typically people get involved in that sort of distance, and then from there they'll kind of slowly progress their distances as they maybe get older, realise they're not fast enough for shorter distances, or maybe they're just more suited to slightly more aerobic events.
Do you think that there's actually something behind that, or do you think that it's important to kind of limit, people going up to those distances early? Like, do you think that there's actually benefit in sort of delaying it?
Well, I mean, like most of your aerobic capacity sort of maximizes as you get more towards your late 20s, early 30s. And
it seems like in Australia and females, it's in your 40s.
Well, that's it. I think we're at a pretty unique situation now. I think it might not happen, but it's a really, really high likelihood that every single one of the marathoners we send to the Olympics is going to be a mum.
Yep.
So they're all in their at least mid to late 30s and have a child, which is kind of probably something.
Does having a child increase your aerobic capacity?
Well, I don't know, but there's a few super mums out there now, just honestly kind of running ridiculously fast, and some of them not long after having a baby as well.
Does that say that it's easy?
I don't think it's easy for anyone, but it's definitely the sort of thing where we don't really know why they're running so well, but there's a lot of women who've stepped up to the marathon post having children who are running really well.
I think it's interesting because obviously we've seen a lot of people step up, from 5, 10K, and then or even, if you take someone like Gregson, she obviously came from the steeplechase. Now she's gone up to marathon and they're having success. Izzy Bat-Doyle, 5, 10K, she's gone up to the marathon, she's doing well. Do you think that them delaying is actually, Izzy's a bit younger, but do you think it's actually something they could have done earlier and actually had success, and potentially they're leaving it later in their career? It doesn't seem to be limiting people because, as we've seen with the two elder statesmen of the team there, you've got two mums in their 40s who are mid 40s are doing really well. So whether they're being limited on time, I don't think seems to be the case. But do you think that if people had have jumped in earlier, they would have actually got more benefit out of their marathon career?
It's really hard to say. Like, I personally don't think so. I don't think they would have got more out of it just because of the nature of the event. It's like a lot of the, I guess, development that you see in those athletes over time. They're kind of getting stronger. Their volume's usually increasing over time. By the time they actually start doing marathon training, like, they're already kind of established athletes that are then capable of doing bigger long runs, sessions in the back end of their long runs, hitting mileage of 160k a week, which maybe they wouldn't have been so tolerant to when they were around that sort of 18 to 20 years.
You just mentioned 160 k's a week. So for most people, they hear that and they think, what are you talking about? You driving a car 160 k's a week. How does a marathoner actually, or a distance runner, break down 160 k's in a week? What does that actually look like day to day? Is it, I know that a lot of them will do double sessions, a run in the morning, a run in the afternoon, something like that. But what does it actually look like? Can you explain to listeners what trying to get 160 k's in a week looks like?
I think the most important thing is that if you're going to fit 160 k's in a week, most of it has to be easy. So when I say easy, it's running that is realistically in that sort of zone 2 sort of area.
We'll come back to that because I'll get you to explain some of the zones. But what does the week look like? What typically for someone trying to get that amount of running in?
You jog, so let's maybe do it from Monday to Sunday.
Perfect, yeah.
On a Monday, you might go and jog for an hour in the morning, maybe go and do another half hour in the afternoon.
Yep.
Tuesday, in Australia, we typically follow quite a similar structure for most distance runners. So for most, it will be like a session on a Tuesday morning or a Tuesday evening with kind of often an easy jog, either in the morning if they're doing their main session in the evening, or vice versa. Wednesday would typically be a bit of like a midweek sort of like long run where they might hit sort of 90 minutes around that sort of mark. Some will do a little bit longer. Thursday, maybe again, slightly easier, hour in the morning, 30 minutes in the evening. Friday, very similar to Tuesday, session in your morning, kind of easy jog in the evening. Saturday, another kind of hour easy, plus or minus a double in the afternoon, again, half an hour or so. And then Sunday, long runs. So for a marathoner, we're probably looking around like at least 2 hours, often more like 2.5 hours.
For you, Sam, you're doing your first marathon this year, and so you're obviously building up the training to be able to compete at that and perform at a high level. Why has you decided now to transition to that distance? Is that something that you had planned several years in advance? Has it been something that you discussed more recently with your coach? Like, what was the actual transition for you to go, all right, I've been doing 5:10s, I want to actually go further now?
There's probably two elements to it. It's one is the kind of training transition, and I feel like I've kind of spent a lot of time training that sort of 5 to 10K sort of distance, and I've raced over it quite a bit, and I kind of want to do something different. I feel like I'm ready for it now. And the other is that like mental challenge of the marathon being something it's unlike any other sort of distance race. Like, so many people just completely like fail, like their bodies break down at 35K, and it's got so many different elements to it that are different to other forms of distance running. So yeah, and so it's exciting from that sense, and I feel like I'm at a stage now with my training where I've actually hit consistent mileage that's almost like the training ready to do the training.
Sure.
Over the past kind of like 3-4 years.
You said they've got some different challenges. What are they? What are those different challenges to, say, running a 10K?
Nutrition, for one, is like a massive thing. So unlike other events where you can kind of just make sure that you're relatively well fueled prior and then you just race, over a marathon, you're going to need to take on fuel during, regardless of how fast you are. And to be honest, the slower you are, probably the more fuel you need to take.
Even in the really elites, are they still doing that? You know, I often see like a lot of the Africans aren't eating anything.
And you see a lot of them blow up too.
I know, but you see the ones that win, they don't stop for anything. They pour some water on their head and they keep going.
I would say that anyone who's winning one of those world marathon majors has a nutrition team behind them. And they are like taking on fuel, whether that fuel is, you know, what we typically do in Australia, where we're taking on kind of like gels and things like that, or if they just prefer to have some like jelly beans or something like that during the race, or the drinks they're actually having themselves have electrolytes or carbohydrate in them. They'll all be taking on some fuel, and the evidence is pretty clear that it improves performance.
Oh yeah.
Well, I was going to ask that. We actually had a guest on recently, Professor John Hawley, who's done a lot of research in consumption of energy in the form of carbohydrates and fat related to performance. In your experience and the people that you run with, do you see that typically people consume much more of a higher carbohydrate diet, or do you see some people trying to shift and adapt to more like high fat, low carb? Or do you see a combination of both? What are your observations and experiences with it?
It's interesting because there's been that sort of period where I think it was quite popular to do the whole like fasting into like your long run, for example, to try and facilitate some adaptation to use fat sources instead of, or become better at using fat sources as you're whilst running a little bit faster. I would say that kind of, in Australia at least, that trend isn't super strong at the moment. I think the availability of lightweight carbohydrate that you can take on your runs and compete with, and also the availability at like aid stations as well, means that realistically, like, you don't necessarily need so much of that adaptation because you have access to these things during a race.
Sure.
The thing that you got to be aware of, though, I'm pretty sure the point he was making was not adaptation to fuel management. It's actually making your training physically more stressful. Therefore, the adaptation is actually to performance, not to how well you use substrate.
No, I should probably clarify related to performance. Do people see, or do you personally, or people that you run with, see improvements in performance focusing on one form of energy intake, i.e. like carbs versus fat?
I would say most people I know are pretty high on the carb side of things. I'm not aware of anyone that I compete with who is more on a kind of high fat sort of diet that limits their carbohydrate intake. But whether or not that's kind of detrimental to like how much we get out of our training, I'm not sure. I'd imagine there's more risks involved in terms of an injury standpoint. If you are kind of adding that additional stress to your training, it would have to be managed quite carefully. Doesn't mean it's not possible. Again, like everything, if you're managing things carefully, you can add in another stressor. But it's not typically something we see. But again, distance runners tend to be a little bit old-fashioned in that sort of stuff too sometimes.
What, just do what has worked before for other people? Basically? Yeah,
people just eat what they want, and kind of like the main focus for a lot of dietitians, particularly that work with athletes, is just getting fuel in because, we eat a lot.
Is that your focus then with regards to nutrition, just getting enough calories in, or do you focus a lot on like
particularly post sessions? Okay. So I think it's for me, the change, like I've always been I've never really limited myself when it comes to the amount of food that I eat. I've kind of eaten quite intuitively in that sense. But it was more about timing post sessions, trying to get in protein and carbohydrate following like high stress workouts that can help facilitate the adaptation following those sessions.
Talking about intuition, I know we were talking a little bit off air before, talking about your current training program. And you were talking about how when you think about setting intensities, a lot of it is intuitive. So you said you actually don't necessarily use a heart rate monitor, but you've been running for so long, you actually have that ability to know what intensity you're at. Is that something that you see commonly with a lot of experienced distance runners? Do you see them using lots of different types of tech like heart rate monitors or even other sort of monitors that are much easier to use now with like looking at like blood analysis for things like lactate?
I think like the kind of heart rate and that sort of thing is very easily accessible to people. Anyone can go and buy a heart rate monitor. The blood lactate stuff, yes, you can buy it, but it's not cheap. And a lot of people don't know what they're looking at either. So I would say that, to be honest, across distance running in Melbourne, probably across Australia, there's not much of that gets used. Most of it does tend to be quite intuitive. I think like using heart rate as a proxy for your intensity can work quite well for you to kind of be like, oh no, I'm doing all my easy running too quick at the moment. I need to back that off. But like I would never really go out the door and kind of be checking my watch every, 30 seconds or so to make sure that it's not getting above like 140, 150 or something like that. I would just kind of cruise out and I know now what that's supposed to feel like. And if I'm working a little bit hard, I can kind of have that sort of, I get that feeling that it's a little bit too quick and I can back off for the day. But I've been running for 12 years. That wasn't always the case. And I run slower now on my easy jogs than I did 5 years ago.
Yeah,
I think
you mentioned that before because I think it's a really good thing to discuss. If you can, maybe describe what those zones, you mentioned like zone 2. Can you describe what those zones are and then where you would place them in terms of your sessions? Obviously, you just mentioned the longer, easier runs, what zone they would sit in and what that actually means.
Yeah. So I guess the two major zones that we'd kind of sit in for most of our training is like probably zone 2 and zone 4 are the big ones.
So
we spend
start
time
from the start. What are the zones?
Zone 1, you're pretty much at rest. You're not really doing very much. It's very
heart rate's, is baseline.
Yeah. Zone 2.
They're usually based on heart rate
That's right.
measures, aren't they? Correct.
Yeah. So zone 2 is going to be basically this slightly more intense than at rest, but it's a very kind of cruisy sort of pace where you can maintain it for a long period of time. And I guess the intensity probably isn't going to be like limited for you. You're going to just get hungry and probably want to stop.
In that zone for you, I know it does vary from person to person, but where would your heart rate sit generally with that?
Like around the 130, 140
Okay.
sort
so
of
you're working, but it's not particularly taxing.
Yeah.
If you were to give it like, a rating of perceived exertion, I'm sure the RPE scale, you can either do it out of 20, use the Borg scale, or you want to do it out of 10, but what would you, as a percentage of effort, how hard would you say you're working in that zone?
Like a 2 to 3 out of 10.
Yeah, so you're kind of ticking along and it's not particularly stressful. I think the one, from a practical sense, I think the thing you always say to people is you should be able to jog and talk at the same time.
Yeah,
if you can do that, then you're probably in that zone and you're pretty comfortable.
And I imagine that's quite difficult for a lot of novice runners psychologically because the reality is people love to get obsessed with times, but
pushing all the time.
Exactly. But if you're running, let's say 25 minutes for 5Ks, this kind of zone 2 would be a very slow pace. Would it be like 6 minutes plus per kilometer?
Yeah, and that's I think where a lot of new runners do go wrong is that their intensity is often higher than that for like long periods of time during their running.
So for someone like yourself who's got experience and some intuition to know where you are in those zones, what are recommendations you give for younger runners? Is it something that you think that they actually do need to monitor with technology, like using a
get
heart
an
rate
idea
monitor?
at the start?
Yeah, potentially for sure. I think that using that practical sort of like, can you talk to someone? Can you go for get them to go for a run with their mates and be like, I just want you to have a conversation and cruise around.
Yeah. If you can do that, then generally you're not working that
I feel
hard.
like I'll have to walk to do that.
Yeah.
And then what would zone 3 be?
Zone 3, we're sort of beginning to move towards that sort of, it's not quite at threshold yet. Well, we'll get to what threshold is in a second, but it's this sort of, I call it almost like the gray zone. It's this area where you're not running easily anymore, but you're not at a kind of like high intensity yet. So this is the bit that probably a lot of new runners end up in.
Yeah.
When they start.
It's a zone where they know they're working hard, but they're not going to blow up in a short-term period. But they couldn't talk either.
Yeah. Yeah. So like if you find yourself on a run and maybe you've been dragged along by a group that's a little bit too fast for where you're at the moment.
Yeah. You can keep going, but you're not talking. They're chatting and you're at the back kind of just holding on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yeah, like I said, that's where a lot of new runners start because it feels too slow to run maybe at that zone 2 sort of pace. We then move into like our zone 4, which is we're kind of talking about that tipping point between you starting to, it's a pace that typically you can hold for maybe an hour of intensity, like without breaking down. And threshold kind of refers to this threshold of when you start developing lactate. So the intensity is too hard for you to be clearing the lactate effectively. But if you can kind of just sit at it, it'll just hit a level that you can tolerate and you'll stay there for a long period of time.
We spoke about this with Jeremy Weeks when he was on our podcast about, you start to see these inflection points, it goes from, 2 millimole to 4, and you start saying, okay, can they sit there and not necessarily see that continue to rise?
Yeah. And then intensity above that, we're talking the sort of things.
Above threshold, yeah.
Yeah, above threshold. We're then going into things where we do it for intervals, where we would not expect you to do it for 30 to 40, 50 minutes straight during training.
Yeah, and that kind of training is quite typical, isn't it? They talk about doing threshold efforts, and it's it might be an 8 or 10 minute burst, and they'll do that 2, 3, 4 times to try and see if they can elevate their lactate, let it come back down, elevate it again. So they're sitting in that zone. The whole idea, obviously, you can explain more if you want what that experience is like. But it's to try and slowly shift up where that threshold kicks in.
Yeah.
Because obviously the whole aim, even in a marathon, is can you run as fast as you can without starting to hit towards that threshold, because it means you're still staying in your aerobic zone and you're going to be able to maintain it, as you said, for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So I guess that's associated with being able to buffer it and clear it out more effectively.
Of course,
yeah. So adaptation that's happening all throughout your body is all about delivering oxygen and nutrients and clearing out stuff that's going to inhibit your performance.
So to put it into context then, Sam, because I think this is something that's really worth highlighting. For someone like yourself who's currently running, over 100 kilometers per week, wanting to build up to that 150, 160 kilometers to your marathon, how much of that training is at that zone 2 sort of sub-race pace?
Probably roughly 80%. The vast majority of it's slow, easy. I would go run with people and chat, or I'll listen to a podcast or music, or even just like this morning, I just didn't have anything on and just kind of went for a jog along the river, listened to the sounds and stuff. And it's, for me, this is a kind of separate thing, but for me, that's also like a little bit of a meditative state as well.
All right, here's a question. There's 2 questions. We'll get to the first one. I've heard that the Kenyans don't do this. They run a lot faster, right? Are they right? Or are they just different because they've been doing it that way for a long time? You hear stories of them running much faster than what would be considered zone 2.
As a majority of them.
Runs.
Okay.
We even like this, is it Kipsang?
Kiptum.
From what I've heard, his training's nuts.
Yeah.
He's doing 300 kilometers per week sort of stuff, and he's doing it fast. Like, he's not running at 5-minute pace for a guy who can run obviously 2 hours, 2:01, 2:02, whatever it is. He's running it at 3:30, like stupid stuff.
Yeah.
Is that rubbish, one, or is that just he's a nutcase and he's actually just adapted to doing that kind of stuff?
He's an exception.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's I reckon it is a little bit of an exception to the rule. Sort of, there's not many people who are going to be able to tolerate those loads without breaking down. And I think we're also talking about someone who, from a evolutionary point of view, if you look at an African's kind of shape and the way that they move, they're so elastic.
Bring up biology.
But they're such an elastic kind of population, and you watch them move, they just bounce along.
Well, here's a question for you then, because this is the second question.
Yeah.
Do you think that long runs develop aerobic capacity, or do they develop elastic properties?
I would say both. I think you spending a lot of time on your feet. You're obviously trying to develop both a metabolic sort of adaptation to being on your feet for a long period of time and using your aerobic system for a long period of time.
Question: if that's the case, why do once they get to a certain level of training, their VO2 doesn't keep going up, and it doesn't seem to be as well correlated with their, say, marathon performance?
Particularly at the elite level.
At the elite level, you see 2 people. One might have 80 as their, VO2, and one might have 75, and the 75 person beats the 80. All right? You would say they're probably doing similar volumes of training. The separation point there clearly suggests that one's more efficient than the other. They're running economies potentially better. I've been arguing this for a while, that once you get past the general level of training capability, that the long run's actually the reason. It's more about, as you mentioned, it's time on your feet and number of steps, because you're actually trying to develop elastic capabilities.
Yeah.
Which in the early 2000s, I think, Philo Saunders showed that you can make big changes to that using things like plyometrics. And I've tried to argue this with a couple of people, but they say, shut up, you're a sprints coach. That I don't actually think that people need to do that volume of really long stuff, right? Every distance person you talk to is like, shut up, you don't have an idea what you're talking about. But I will say that there has been an example of it recently, which is that young woman from Florida, the NCAA's, the Velby Parker.
I'm not sure.
She's been flogging everyone. She won the cross-country NCAA's, and she said she only runs 2 or 3 days a week with injury. Right? And she's doing a lot of her aerobic stuff off her feet. So to me, it's really interesting. Like, potentially you can get a lot of the adaptations you want without actually necessarily doing the longer stuff.
Yeah.
Potentially she's getting that through aerobic adaptation, but she's doing it. I don't know, you mentioned this again off air about, you recently had a bit of an injury that you were managing and you were doing really long cycling and stuff like that. So it obviously brings forth the idea that you can attack it from multiple angles, but this, ubiquitous, I've got to do all this long running is not necessarily the panacea it's meant to be.
It's super interesting. Like, I think you've probably touched on an area that is sensitive to an area, like a group of people that are quite traditional. Like, our training system is not exactly the same, but it's based off like works of someone who, like Arthur Lydiard. They're talking through kind of training methods that are like.
I always
really
get myself
old.
into trouble because people say like, are you interested in coaching distance? I say no, because it's easy. And they go, what do you mean? I was like, everyone does the exact same thing. And it's like, as long as you survive, you're going to run well.
Do you think the caveat is perhaps based on the maturation of the individual? Like, once they've reached a certain capacity, build up their metabolic capacity to a certain point, do you need to see a bit of a transition to think of how do you maximize their elastic capacity to then optimize running
it's
economy?
Probably both, isn't it? Like, if you can, as Sam said, like if you can do both, like at the same time and develop those capacities concurrently, you're probably going to get more improvement overall.
Sure.
Yeah, and I like going back to, I guess, like what those long runs do. Like I said, I think they do both. I don't think it is just about the metabolic side of things. I think time on feet's really underrated, and like most people, their bodies are just smashed at the end of a marathon.
Yeah.
Because they're not able to necessarily tolerate the volume of time they're on their feet at that sort of pace, and that's, I guess, probably where getting some help from some strength and conditioning, or like actually throwing in some plyometrics into your training, is actually beneficial and something that's really.
You're making me laugh because I want to ask this question. It's a very traditional. Why do distance runners absolutely hate doing anything other than running? If you say to them, as you just said, like maybe you should do some strength, like they're like, oh, I'd rather just run. How about you do some stretching? Oh, nah, I don't want to do that either.
I think people run for lots of different reasons. I think if you look at the sort of competitive end of the spectrum, most distance runners are doing some strength work now. And it's like...
I'm saying like there's a group in between, and I say this is the caveat, is having met and worked with a number of, not necessarily always in a professional setting, but spoken with and worked with some people that are very elite. They're very professional. They do everything that you would suspect that an elite athlete's doing. They're doing all of their recovery stuff. They're doing, as I said, they're all over their nutrition plan. They're doing, strength and conditioning with a qualified person. They've got a really strong medical team behind them, and their coach is very much across everything. And they've got a physiologist usually behind them as well. But there's a middle band, and you probably fit into this band of people. Now you're a bit different because obviously you've got, healthcare background. But there are a middle band of people who are like, they're at national level, but they're not quite making international teams, who they can often be really, really stubborn about like, no, I'll just do more Ks, like that'll fix the problem. And it seems to be this thing that often holds some of those people back, is their answer to everything is like, I'll just keep running, I'll just do more.
Just to clarify, John, when you said that he fits into this, you're talking more about his actual standard as opposed to his his mindset, his actual
No.
mindset or approach.
As I said, Sam's different because yeah, you're correct. Sam's different because obviously Sam, I think you obviously very much think about what other things you need to do to support your volume of running. But you're at that sort of like national level where if you get things right in the next few years, you potentially open up the opportunity for international, performance. You're easily above sort of the general state level, and you're in that pocket of like, if I do well, like I can finish top 5 or top 10 in like cross country, or I can, maybe make a world cross team or something like that, right? But there are a lot of people I think sit in that zone to me, and it's not the right word because I feel it's not lazy because they obviously train a lot, but they're kind of
It's just habitual, do you think?
and they're very limited. Like I only do this, right? Like, and it's lots of running.
Yeah, I think this is like a really interesting topic because, like, to be honest, for a long period of time, particularly in my like late juniors and early like senior running career, I probably was that person.
Okay.
So
what changed?
I think one, studying physio probably makes a big difference. Like I think when you start to become aware of the way that performance can be supported by more than just running.
Yeah, I think that's a great word that you use because I don't think anyone should be confused. The main thing is the main thing. So if you want to be a marathon runner and you think you're going to get away with doing not enough running, you're probably not going to get very far unless you're a complete exception, right? And it does happen. I mentioned someone like Belby Parker, but generally, most people, as you said, are doing 100, 150 plus Ks per week to be in that elite category. You can't really get away from that. You still need to do those. But there are other things that will help support that level of running.
Yeah, the way to get better at running is to run more, but you can't run more if you don't give yourself capacity to do so.
Exactly, yeah.
So, like, I think for a lot of distance runners, we do hit that, like, all right, we're now like in our early 20s, we're kind of shifting. Maybe you finish uni and you're kind of starting full-time work. And we don't necessarily, like, I think it's actually a bit of a problem in our sport in that we don't actually have enough coaches who are like pushing strength and conditioning from a developmental point of view.
We don't really have enough high-level coaches. Like we see this. I think this is one of the biggest problems in Australia, and this is me going on a rant, but it's one of the biggest problems we see in Australia is we don't have good structures in terms of a development pathway, right? It very much relies on individual coaches having to set up structures, right? And there are great coaches. That's not the issue, but it's very much done in a private or a club setting, which is not professional by any sort of major means, and it means that unless you're involved with one of those clubs or involved with the school or whatever that kind of pushes you towards that coach, you can kind of be left in the dark for a while until you go, oh, I'm not getting there. Maybe I should go run with this group because they've got a few athletes that are going well. I need to change what I'm doing. And I always have this discussion with people about the biggest, I genuinely think the biggest thing holding back track and field and running in this country, even though we're having more success, and that's largely due to individual coaches, I believe, going above and beyond, is the fact that we don't have a clearly defined pathway. To me, if you're at a school or an environment, whether it's a club or you're consistently going to, say, national junior championships, you should actually be funneled into, okay, you should be now going to this squad.
Yeah.
Right. And it should be a thing that people do. And it happens a little bit, but people are like, oh, no, I'm going to stay with my junior coach and I'm going to stay at my club. And it's like, that's, if you're in the AFL, you don't go, oh, I'm just going to play for my junior club. I'm not going to go join, Melbourne Football Club. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I think, and a big part of that is like coaches seeing that long-term athlete development as like a priority.
Yep.
And it was something I think you guys have spoken about before, is like giving people the tools when they're younger to develop capacity to do later training. So, general movement patterns that are like going to support being able to do high mileage later on in life. Developing those elastic properties early. Really simple things that can support you to then kind of enter higher level sport later. And I don't think running does that particularly well.
No, but it's because we don't have these pathways. Like, Did you do the little athletics?
I actually started when I was around like 14, so I missed the little aths.
That's fine. Yeah, but there's people who, for instance, would have done little athletics. They have the junior development squads. That's called JDS. And then the same thing happens, which I think is interesting with, they've done it now in most states, and they have these development squads. But they end at, I think it's under 20s or under 21s or whatever. And there seems to be a bit of a thing in Australia, and I know this comes from the high performance team, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but their general position is that they're not going to tell athletes where to go, which on a personal level, I don't really agree with, right? And I know that sounds really mean, but we don't have enough talent, I don't think, to wait and see whether someone gets to a certain level or they start to go backwards before anyone intervenes, or they end up going, oh, this isn't working, I've got to go to a better environment, right? And we have a system, I've got a few athletes who've gone through, and some are still in the VIS, where they come and say, oh, we're going to put structures around that coach and that athlete, rather than being like pulling them into an environment that already has structure to it. And so they're at a very individual level, they're having to go out and create these environments, which I think is a lot more resource heavy, a lot more time consuming, and often it's a very big learning curves for the people who actually have to be setting up those environments, like i.e. the coach. Like if you have I don't know how it works with you, but for instance, if you have, I know you run for Glen Huntley. Did you run for them as a junior?
Yeah, I've run with them since I was about 13.
So say, for instance, you're a talented distance runner. Your coach might be someone who's just a club coach, right? They might not be, but say if they're a club coach and you come along and they're doing really well with you, I believe the culture should be one where it's like, Sam, you've got ability. I'm now forwarding you on to this coach and this squad because you are good enough to be at this level, right? Unless that coach themselves has those things already set up, right? The current way that we do it is we do the opposite. And we go, oh, Sam, stay with your coach. We'll put support around that coach and build this whole thing and teach them all of this stuff, which might take them, and I say this from a personal experience point of view, because it's a learning curve that I've had to go through, which I actually think I should not have even been afforded. It sounds silly to say that to myself, but I think that they should have been like, no, rather than your athlete, the coach developing along that pathway, they should actually just go to a coach who already knows that stuff, right? And people hate that because they're like, but I think it's one of the big issues that's letting down our sport is we think that because someone maybe found some talent or developed it a little bit, that they have the right to hold on to that. And I don't really think it works that way. And it's this idea of people not moving between environments, I think, is limiting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like using myself as an example, like I changed training groups from the group I was with as a junior when I was 18.
Yeah.
That was a decision I made because at training I found I was doing all of my sessions by myself. And, we talked already a little bit about the fact that most distance training isn't that dissimilar. Like a lot of the stuff was the same.
Yeah, you could have been doing the same sessions. It's not going to change a hell of a lot, but you're probably looking for a more advanced environment.
And also an environment that maybe encouraged things like doing some strength and conditioning, because that wasn't something that I included in my training at all up until I was in my early 20s. And that was something that I kind of started doing a little bit because I was around better athletes than me and people who were more professional than I was. And that was purely based on luck because I was just kind of like, I feel like I need a change. And so I started with a new coach who happened to have an athlete and therefore had those support structures around them.
And that's what I find interesting. Like you use the word luck. And I was like, I don't think that the Athletics Australia development model should be based on luck.
Yeah.
But like if there's someone like yourself and who say you do a few marathons and you're like, okay, actually I'm getting there. And, how old are you now? 27?
26. Yeah.
Say by 30, you're down to, and it's 4 years' time, we're going to LA and you're like, okay, I'm going to qualify for this marathon. There's some likelihood that you've ended up there because of luck, because you ended up picking the right coach.
Pick the right course to study.
Yeah, but it's those kind of things of like, that can't be the model.
Yeah.
Right, like if it was identified early on, okay, this guy's got some talent. We don't know if he's going to necessarily make it, but you should be kind of directed towards this kind of environment, and that environment should already be set up in a way that supports that for whatever period of time is needed for that person to reach that level.
I think that's what's interesting, and I think is something that the US does really well.
Well, I think the university system supports that.
Exactly.
It sort of filters quite heavily and supports that to get to that level.
We also look at a lot of our top Australian distance runners at the moment. The vast majority of them went to college. So you look at people like Lyndon Hall went to college. People who are coming through now like Kai Robinson, Pat Tiernan, they're all people who actually spent this 4-year block becoming professional athletes when they weren't actually at a level that they would have been supported in Australia.
I guess also too in the States, there's also a good incentive to do that because tertiary education in the States is so expensive. So if someone has a certain talent, skill set in the sport, it's an opportunity for them to go to university and not get a massive, student loan debt in the process.
Yeah, it's an interesting one too, because I think even 10 years ago, the overriding sentiment was don't go to college because they break everybody. And I feel like there's been a big shift, and potentially it's a change in the overall culture of how they prepare athletes. And, understanding is getting better, knowledge gain is always increasing. We're seeing the opposite now. It's almost like if you can get into a good university in the US, it's a good opportunity because they continuously are producing consistent high-level results now, particularly in the distance.
Yeah, and it's again those places where like schools have renowned programs that people go to, not the other way around, where someone goes, "Oh, I'm a really good US-based athlete. I live in the sticks. Please come and support me and my junior coach." Even though like I'm a talented runner, I can go and run whatever time for 5K. So they're running like 14 minutes when they're 18 or something. Like
no, they want to go join a program.
Yeah.
They're picking one of the big programs to go into, and obviously they do seem to divide into distance schools and sort of speed power events. But it is interesting that because that's a very, very different idea, and I personally think it works a lot better. And I don't know that it will change necessarily here until the structures below that, the school age structures change. But I do think that there needs to be a culture of you're at this level, this is the kind of environment we encourage you to be in. And if I don't know, maybe I'm too harsh, but I'm almost the opposite way around of like, we won't give you support unless you go into one of these environments rather than, we'll give you support in your environment. As you said, like we'll put it around you and your junior coach.
Yeah. I think what's a really interesting thing at around that sort of age as well is people will typically be starting their like careers as well. Time becomes more limited, and you ask why people don't do strength training. They don't prioritize it because they don't know the value of it, and they've got other things going on in their life, and they just go, I like running, I'm going to run more.
Yeah.
So I think giving them more supports. I think long-term athlete development, particularly from that period from 18 to say 25, is where we see so many of our athletes fall off, and finding some ways to encourage smarter, more professional training in that period will allow a greater number of high-quality athletes to reach an age where they can actually start making teams rather than relying on people like, Cam Myers, who's like this ridiculously fast 17-year-old.
Yeah.
Getting those things before maybe other things in his life.
And he's lucky in the sense of, he's in Canberra and the community is smaller. And so it becomes very obvious where you should go.
Yeah.
Like he's with Dick Telford. And if you're a distance runner in Canberra, I know there are a couple of others. I think it's Des Proctor is the other one. I think he's in Canberra as well.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
But there's basically only like 2 or 3 places you can go. And those people are already really good and they've got good environments. And so he could have ended up at one of those coaches, he would have been fine. Whereas you go in somewhere like Melbourne, there's a track in every suburb basically. And a lot of people have too much loyalty to like, oh, that's my club or that's my junior coach, rather than being like, oh no, I should shift a couple of suburbs over and train with that group because they're at a different level. It seems to be changing. I think people are going towards that, but it's something I find interesting.
Yeah.
In the spirit of time, I want to ask you about shoes.
Yeah. Cool.
We know it's something that obviously you're not a podiatrist, but you spend a lot of time working in an environment, understanding shoe technology and shoes. And we have spoken in the past for people who do want to go back and have a listen to Hunter Rubino, who was working at Up There. But from your perspective, what's going on in shoes at the moment, and maybe explain to people what's happened in the last 5-6 years that's really shifted shoe technology.
Yeah. So I think there's two components to it, really. There's the performance side of things, and then there's the kind of probably more important for most runners, which is more that like your daily trainer, generic kind of workhorse footwear. Let's start maybe with the simpler stuff, like the daily trainer stuff.
These are the kind of shoes that people will have been wearing for a long time.
Yeah, this is the shoe that you're doing, for example, you're easy running in, so that most of your volume is coming from this sort of footwear.
And when we say this, so these kind of, running shoes, shoes that people have probably had, it's what you would have grown up with. The technology in these, whilst it's evolving, it's not necessarily considered this new technology. Is that correct? They're starting to add more of it in, but
there's some actually quite recent changes over the past 2-3 years that have really affected, I guess, traditional running footwear.
Okay.
But as in general, you're right. It's the sort of shoes that people have been wearing for a long time. Probably one of the biggest changes we're seeing in footwear at the moment is the kind of more development of maximal footwear. When I say that, I'm talking about big chunky soles.
Yeah, large foam.
Yeah, that are quite stiff, have a significant rocker through the shoe. Like that's infiltrating kind of a lot of different brands. A lot of this stems from brands like Hoka being a really, really fast growing brand and other ones trying to follow suit a little bit. But what it's done is it's meant that a lot of shoes that used to be quite simple, low stacked, firm, have now gotten a lot softer and have changed from what people are used to.
And what's the value in that? What are they trying to achieve with that? And are they seeing that play out in performance?
Do you want the skeptics answer?
Yes, I do.
The skeptics answer is to sell more shoes.
Yep.
Like they want to, like it's easy to advertise things like, oh, it's softer, like it's a smoother ride, all this sort of stuff. It's very easy to advertise. What you lose when you kind of get a shoe that gets softer and chunkier, that's a bigger lever to exacerbate any sort of mechanical things that you have going on. So if you are in say you've been running a neutral shoe for your entire life, a neutral shoe 10 years ago would have been pretty firm plank of foam.
Yep.
You can't really compress.
You can't deviate too much. It's the compressibility and compliance in it is there, but it's not significant.
Yeah.
And saying that, does that mean that you get much more wear on the shoes a lot quicker?
With the softer ones now? Typically you'll get through them a bit quicker. We've probably seen the life of shoes probably decrease by about
and that's good for
100.
the shoe companies.
It's not bad for the shoe companies, but I think people are prioritizing experience over durability as well. But I guess getting back to that, what that losing that firmness means is that someone who couldn't necessarily, compress the inside edge of a shoe that was typically a neutral shoe, it's gotten a lot softer, now they can.
And what's that leading to in terms of outcome?
So if we think about what we're doing is we're kind of going to put your whole body weight through the shoe and then go to push off, you're essentially trying to generate stiffness for propulsion during that and get yourself in a stable position to do so. If you're in a shoe that's kind of compressed on the inside edge, you've got to pull yourself back before you can actually then go to push off. Otherwise, you're just going to fall off the inside edge of the shoe. That typically loads tissues that do that movement. So things like your tibialis posterior, your plantar fascia for stiffening up your foot significantly more than if you're just kind of going straight on through.
And are you experiencing people reporting more issues in these kind of structures of their foot?
We get people who have worn the same shoe for years come in with the new version of that shoe that's gotten softer, and they go, I don't know what's happened. Like, I just bought the same shoes again. And we go, oh, well, these are the changes that have actually happened to it. You were probably always this mobile and you came across a little bit, but it was okay in the previous versions. And now you're just stressing that part of your body that little bit more.
So you're actually seeing that trend?
Yeah, we see it. We see it pretty frequently, to be honest.
Okay. Going to the more, the category of super shoes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can you explain to people what super shoes are?
Yeah.
And maybe what they should be used for? Because I spend time telling people off because I feel like they use them for the wrong things.
Yeah. The incorrect use of them is very, very prominent.
Which is what?
Yeah, well, explain what they are first.
Yeah, so essentially super shoes referring to a new generation of shoes that started with the Nike Vaporfly 4%. Essentially, it was a shoe that uses what we call like a supercritical foam. It's a foam that compresses a lot more, but also then decompresses really rapidly.
So it gives you that extra boost on it.
Gives you more energy return. The other thing that you need with that sort of shoe.
For a description, that's where the 4% came from. They suggest
4% energy.
Increase energy compared to a standard shoe.
Yeah, so it's all about improving efficiency. Same as like generating greater elastic properties. But in order to then get the maximum benefit out of the energy return, you have to direct that. So that's where like the carbon plate comes into things. So the carbon plate's shaped in a way that it facilitates a forward propulsion.
Yes.
So energy return plus forward propulsion, more efficiency in a running motion.
It forces you into a particular running position.
Yeah.
To go, as you said, go across your foot so that the foam can actually be used effectively.
Yeah, you can have super soft foam. They've tried this before, and it just like mushes. Yeah.
So that's why they've had to insert these carbon plates within the actual foam structure.
That's right. It stiffens up the shoe and directs the force in the right way. It makes your contact times way shorter, and will change the way you run a little bit. So probably facilitating like a greater sort of 4 foot.
Yeah, midfoot, more 4 foot running pattern compared to previous, say, as older generation shoes, people were much more comfortable, from what I could tell, doing more of a standard rear foot, like running action.
Yeah, that's right. So these are shoes that have like now developed, and every brand now has one.
Yeah.
And, you know, they vary a little bit with their geometry. Some are a little bit more aggressive with how they tip you forward, and some are like a little bit smoother feeling. But they all do one now. Their use is designed for racing, like, or high speed sessions.
Yep.
When I say high speed, I'm not talking sprinting, but you know, that's
you guys, it might be sprinting. Like, you know, if you're doing 200 reps or you're doing 400s and you're doing them at, you know, faster than your race pace.
Yeah.
For you guys, that's your sprint
session. Well, let's bring it back to those zones. It's that zone 4 and above work.
Yep.
So it's that stuff you're not doing a whole heap of, but you want to run faster, you want to feel faster as you're doing it. And they're designed to help you do that and make you more efficient as you do it. Where the problem comes in is that people buy them as their one running shoe, and then they're using it for everything. Now, taking it back to the components of that shoe, it's using a really hyper compressible foam. It's not, most of the time, they're not very stable. And they're designed for when you want to run a little bit faster, and they'll facilitate you to run a little bit faster. If you want to just kind of plod along and maybe you get a little bit more whole foot sort of contact when you're jogging versus when you're doing faster work, the shoe doesn't have much guts in that area typically. And so you end up basically wearing these shoes that are not designed for, one, durability, 2, they're unstable, and you're trying to do everything in them. And it's just a massive change from what we consider a safe daily trainer.
So what's the recommendations you usually give people if they come in and see you to buy shoes and they're saying, oh, I'm going to buy these?
Yeah.
Do you actually talk to them about, okay, well, this is probably what you should use them for, and for these type of running days, you probably want to stay with a more, you know, traditional running shoe?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So we'd consider something like, you know, using Nike as the example again, a Vaporfly, their current shoe.
Yeah.
Like that's an and shoe. It's a shoe you have in your rotation that you can use for some faster stuff, but it doesn't replace your daily trainer.
Yeah, I love that you say it's an and shoe. It's not it's like not your only running shoe.
Yeah, and like, to be honest, there's not a lot of good quality evidence around running shoes and injury and all this sort of stuff. It's pretty poor. You know, it's the whole like the studies that are really poorly designed, and they don't actually account for a lot of different things. But the only evidence that's actually consistent amongst them is that having more than one shoe in your rotation actually is a protective factor because it loads your body differently.
Yes. And that variability is what is actually valuable for you to maintaining, you know, not overload on one particular area or tissue.
Yeah.
And the way that it forces you to run.
People have been doing that in different ways for a long time.
Of course.
Yeah. Terrain changes, like
it's
all
really
that sort of
way
stuff.
Doing that variability, yeah.
But like you can do it with footwear as well. But yeah, it's that and shoe that you want to use for faster training. It's not your daily trainer.
Yeah. Do you still see people interested in using minimalist type shoes?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we still stock them. Like they're still around. There's a lot less of them.
It was a big trend, wasn't it? Into sort of that McDougall's book about, you know, the you can never say this thing is the Tarahumara tribe.
Yeah, the Mexican That Tribe. Yeah, it's a pretty cool book. But it's really interesting that we get these like trends. I think we're at the tipping point of the maximalist trend at the moment. I personally think it's going to tip back because it's getting too much now. And too many people have shoes that they used to wear that are no longer suitable for them. I think, like everything, the kind of best way forward is to do something in the middle. You kind of like can have like a minimalist shoe is going to load different parts of your foot that you're not used to using, like, and develop stronger features through your foot and ankle complex. But again, you can't use them for everything when you're not accustomed to them.
I was going to say, like you alluded to before, the big issue is when people make significant changes to their footwear that alter their mechanics.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
That's where people seem to run into problems where all of a sudden they're getting Achilles tendon pain or stress fractures or whatever it may be. I mean, one of many things, really. It's not the only thing, of course.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, you can have the worst mechanics in the world, and if you just kind of like really, really progressively increase, or you don't do that much, you might get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a risk factor that can really heavily influence how much you load an area of your body.
Yes.
And if you can adjust that, particularly if you're having issues with that area, like if you've got chronic Achilles tendon pain, if you chuck someone in a high drop shoe, so much higher at the back than at the front, like you're offloading that tissue, and maybe you can allow them to kind of do their rehab better during that phase as well.
I think that's, I think the big thing that you alluded to there that's really important is, you mentioned the shoes and whether they're associated. It's really clear that obviously the development of injuries, particularly these insidious ones, are multifactorial. So it's, as you mentioned, it's not to say that the shoe is not an influencer. It's just the fact that it's not necessarily always the only influencer. It might be, as you said, the way they run, the type of shoe they're wearing, what their intrinsic properties around their foot, ankle, knee, calf, everything like that is doing. Are they strong? Are they elastic? Do they have range of motion? Are they flexible? All those kind of things that all culminate in whether that tissue is going to be overloaded when they do change that shoe.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, you might have someone come in who's got really great running history and a really small injury history. Like, they don't really get issues. You might chuck them on the treadmill and have a look at the way they run. They might have a little bit of excess motion. Yeah. Like, they might roll in a little bit. Like, they've got the capacity to deal with that long term.
The thing that you said I think is really valuable is that if people have developed an adaptation to, say, the way they run over a very gradual period of time, especially if it's maybe over 10, 15 years, it can often look quite poor, say, on a technical standard, but actually they've adapted to that.
Yeah.
And that in itself, they don't need to worry that they're going to overload something because they've actually adapted. And as you said, the injury history suggests that they can keep doing that for a long time.
Yeah, and it's the important difference, I think, between like understanding a person and giving someone options of footwear versus just kind of looking at them standing and being like, oh, your foot rolls in. We're going to give you this high support footwear. And it's like, all right, great. So now they're in a shoe that stops them from coming across. They don't absorb as much shock as they're used to, and now they're getting proximal issues. So it's net, like you said, it's multifactorial, and understanding the way that the features of a shoe can change someone's running is probably the important part, and whether or not they have the capacity to deal with changes.
Sam, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us. We're going to have the pleasure of having you around the clinic on an almost daily basis come the end of this month. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and a bit of insights about your running and running in general.
No problem. Thanks for having me.